for joining us for the ARVO and Alcon Keynote. Please welcome to the stage, ARVO President Dr. Patricia D'Amore.
When the world seems to shine like you've had too much wine, that's amore.
Feel free to sing if you like. Good morning, everyone. Thank you and welcome to the ARVO Alcon closing keynote session of the 2024 annual meeting. It's been a really remarkable week filled with discussion, groundbreaking research presentations, and invaluable networking. The new discoveries that have been reported and the collaborations that have been initiated truly elevate our field. Having so many early career researchers here was a particular highlight for me. For a second year in a row, more than half of the accepted abstracts for this year's annual meeting were from our early career researchers, the members in training. As you well know, if you've been listening to me or reading any of my emails, the ARVO Foundation had a matching donation campaign. The challenge was to raise at least $50,000 to match the generous donation by ARVO members, Dr. Renu Nanjum Kaluru. And I'm pleased to announce that we have met that challenge. We've raised more than $50,000 at this point, so that's the challenge plus another $25,000 for membership. But it's never too late to donate. So those $25,000 came from 196 members. You know who you are, and you know who you're not. So, as I pointed out in my opening comments, we had over 11,000 people register. I think the number's like 11,500. And I had made the challenge of everybody giving at least $5. So I'm going to give you another chance. And I don't like people to open their phones while I'm talking, but you can open your app right now to your home page and scroll down and you see a donate button. So if you like, I'm Italian, but I'm not going to strong arm you. If you like, feel free to make a donation right now. $5 is great, whatever you feel like you can afford. And it's money that goes to really a good purpose because it brings in, it funds travel grants for people from around the world who otherwise could not be here. So raise your hand if you're a recipient of a travel grant. Look around you. Most of these people probably wouldn't be able to attend the meeting if it weren't for you. So vote your conscience, let me say it that way. All right, let's see. So now I'd like to announce the winners of the 2024 Members in Training Outstanding Poster Award. The ARVO Members in Training Committee organized and evaluated the best posters by members in training. That was done yesterday. And the evaluation of the finalists was a fun and inspiring and dynamic event. And we appreciate all the judges who participated in this because it could not have been easy. So you're going to see on the slides behind me the winners of each category. And, there are, how many? There's 16 categories, but everybody should have their day in the sun. So I'm actually going to do my best to mention the names of the winners. And if you're in the room, please stand up. So anatomy and pathology is Nilda Sanchez Castellanos. Are you here? I'm not going to ask if they're here because then if they're not, they'll be embarrassed. Biochemistry and molecular biology, Gerda Silva. Clinical epidemiologic research, Anna Voigt. Okay. Cornea, Remya Vatil. E.Y. Randolph Qua. Genetics, cross-section group, William Presley. Glaucoma, Abhilash Katuru. Immunology, Riley Chisney. Lens Sapita I'll do it, Chalhantani. Did I do it? Low vision, Arda Fidanzi. Multidisciplinary ophthalmic imaging, Yao Chai. Physiology, Riley Felister. Retina, Hamin Kang. Retinal cell biology, Jesse Gardner-Russell. Wow, okay. I love this person's last name. Visual neuroscience, Rachel Oaks-Leaf. Love it. Visual psycho-optics, Nicholas Chen. So please join me in congratulating all the winners and the judges who made this possible. So as our closing keynote, we have, I think, a special treat, Dr. Sheril Kirshenbaum. Sheril's an Emmy Award-winning scientist and author. And today she's going to give a talk really focused on one of my passions, as I mentioned last week, which is science communication. So on Sunday, we had the perfect example of somebody communicating science. And today, Sheril's going to give us a talk and tell us how we too can do that. So she's going to explain how effective science communication builds broad interest in science and can foster trust between science, policymakers, and the public. And you know we've had some issues with that in the past several years. Drawing on academic literature and decades of experience in science communication and policy, Sheril will address best practices on how to connect with different audiences, how to counter the rise of misinformation, and promote evidence-based thinking and informed decision-making processes. In 2023, Sheril was awarded a regional Emmy by the National Academy of Television Arts and Science for the PBS series she hosts and writes called Serving Up Science, which is in its 4th season. An academic specialist at Michigan State, Sheril's current research focuses on how senior congressional staffers make decisions about science and policy, because it is the staffers who communicate to the Congress folk on what they should be following. They don't have the bandwidth to do that. So knowing how to communicate with the staffers is the direct link to getting increased funding from the federal agencies. Her work has been published in Science and Nature, and she's featured in the anthology of the best American science writing. Her books include Unscientific America, How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future, and The Science of Kissing, which I actually heard of that podcast. Maybe you can tell us how that arrived. So please join me in welcoming Sheril to the podium for what I'm sure is going to be a really inspiring talk.
I am so excited to be here, to be able to talk to all of you about communicating science. But that begins with the premise that communicating science matters. So I want to turn that around a bit, and I'd like to make talks as interactive as possible. So I'm going to ask you, why? You can raise your hand, you can shout out. Or I can pick on the folks in the front. Anybody, why? You're out to talk about science communication, so why is it important? Because I would agree with that. That's not in my slides, but it is very cool. Anyone else? It makes a difference, yes. Building public trust in science, absolutely. There are so many reasons that science communication is important. Some of the big ones include increasing knowledge. So maybe it's something as simple as we have to help people understand that washing our hands makes us less likely to get sick. Maybe it's about raising awareness. There are more and more insects like ticks spreading disease with the increasing problems related to climate change, so we should be checking ourselves. Maybe it's raising excitement, getting that gee whiz factor out there. Or it could have to do with wanting people to change our behavior, to change our attitudes, whether it's about vaccines or any number of a bunch of science issues that are affecting who we are and how we live. And then, of course, there's the policy piece, which I am absolutely passionate about contributing in that space. And it's also okay to admit some of us need to communicate science because we simply want to be left alone. We need to be able to talk about what we do enough so we can get funded, so nobody bugs us and we can keep doing our research. And I am not judging anyone. That is an entirely valid reason that we need to be able to talk about our work. Now, I've been thinking about science communication for decades. My career started at the University of Maine when I became a marine biologist. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking whales and dolphins, but no, for me, it was the very charismatic sea cucumber. And it was a great project because it got me literally into the Gulf of Maine, even in February. And I was doing a lot of research on how these animals grow, how they reproduce, and largely it was fisheries modeling. So I was looking at how they traveled. It was an emerging fishery in the Gulf of Maine at the time, and there was a policy component where I was working with folks in the state capitol in Augusta and thinking about what kind of management institutions would work for this emerging fishery so it didn't go boom and bust like so many traditionally harvested sea cucumber species all around the world. At the same time, on the side, without telling my advisor, I started working with a pop radio station. And while this sounds like a bit of a weird tangent, it really set me on this path to be interested in how we talk about what we do. Because when I was at the university, I could have an audience that was usually not like we would bring in a speaker and there would be 15, 20 people that would come for their talk. It could be a world famous scientist, and that was considered fine. But with the radio station, we would be raising money for juvenile diabetes or collecting turkeys on Thanksgiving. And we could make an event fun and engaging and bring in thousands of people and raise tens of thousands of dollars by incorporating basic social marketing strategies into our efforts. And I thought, you know, science could probably learn a little bit from some of these other spaces. I went on from UMaine, I got really lucky and I got to do one of those congressional science policy fellowships. So in my 20s, I went to Capitol Hill, started working in the Senate, and I was blown away by both how smart my colleagues working as Senate staffers were, but also how few of them had any kind of science background. And even though at the same time I had also gotten a master's in public policy, I thought I understood how the process worked from the readings and the literature, but I really didn't know what I was wading into. Just to give you an example, the first hour I was in my role, they let me be a full legislative assistant, or LA. I noticed everyone around me is talking about R&D. And in my world, that's research and development. And I'm thinking, wow, these folks are really interested in science. This is great. And literally under an hour, someone kind of nudged me and they were like, they're talking about Republicans and Democrats. And I thought, oh, okay, this is a little bit different. I would have scientists coming through the office whose papers I had read, who I was absolutely, I would admire them so much before they arrived. But oftentimes, the scientists from academia and the research communities were talking about p-values, we're talking about statistics, we're printing out PowerPoint slides. You should never do that if it's a non-academic audience. And at the end of the conversation, they didn't really have a take-home message, and they weren't collaborating with like-minded communities in other spaces. And that was a problem in itself, but at the same time, there were a lot of pseudoscientific groups, special interests, industry lobbyists coming in with things that I could see with my scientific background didn't make sense. But they had fancy PhDs after their names. They might not have been in science, but they were funny and they were engaging and they were clear on their message and strategy. And I was frustrated recognizing that they were probably leaving a much more lasting impression with most staffers who didn't have scientific expertise than many of the best scientists coming through. And that really fundamentally changed my career trajectory, because until that point, I had been expecting to be a tenure-track professor in marine conservation, and instead, I really wanted to work in the space between science, politics, and people. I'm going to show you a short clip from a recent movie which was written as a satire. A lot of people find it very funny. This was the scariest movie I've ever seen. Only to say that while it's supposed to be a satire, I find this wildly believable, and I squirm watching it, but I'm just gonna show you a really short clip from that. It's called Don't Look Up, so some of you might have seen it.
I heard there's an asteroid or a comet or something that you don't like the looks of. Tell me about it. You got 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
Go.
A comet between 5 to 10 kilometers across that we estimate came from the Oort cloud. And using Gauss's method of orbital determination and the average astrometric uncertainty of 0.04.
Whoa. The hell
I'm
is
so
what?
bored. Just tell us what it is. Seriously, stop.
What Dr. Mindy is trying to say is that there's a comet headed directly towards Earth.
And then what happens, like a tidal wave?
It will be far more catastrophic. There will be mile-high tsunamis.
So how certain is this?
There's 100% certainty of impact.
Please, don't say 100%.
Can we just call it a potentially significant event?
But it isn't potentially going to happen.
99.78% to be exact.
Oh, great. Okay, so it's not 100%.
Call it 70% and let's move on.
But it's not even close to 70%.
Let's just use like 60% as a working number.
Okay, we're gonna get our own scientists on this, no offense.
Dr. Mindy is a tenured professor of astronomy at Michigan State.
I'm sorry, did you say Michigan State?
Exactly. They have an excellent astronomy department.
You say so.
Now, I'm not saying every conversation in DC sounds like that, but it's a lot more realistic than I think many of us who are doing the research, who are trying to tell these stories, would like to believe. And that's why I think we need more people with this expertise, navigating space in policy with an understanding of that culture, because it's very different than science communication broadly. There's an ecosystem on Capitol Hill, and we have to understand how information moves, and then we have to be thinking about what we can do to tell our stories more effectively so they have impact. Now, I am certainly not the first person to be interested in communicating science. I often think about C.P. Snow, who in 1959 gave the now famous Reed Lecture in Cambridge called The Culture and the Scientific Revolution. And he talked about this disconnect between scientists and people trained in the humanities. And he was talking about how, on one hand, we have literary intellectuals at one pole, at the other, scientists, and in between them exists a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes hostility, but most of all, a lack of understanding. Now, as I said, he was talking about how we train folks in the humanities and the sciences, but I think we can extrapolate this to be thinking more broadly. How we're trained and how we're training younger folks in science is often quite different than what most people experience in their lives. We don't write the same way. We don't speak the same way. We get very used to the acronyms that we're comfortable with in our communities. We don't always use these things called adjectives in our writing. And that's okay, because the scientific peer review process is really important, but we also have to start thinking more broadly about what's familiar and recognizable and comfortable for most audiences outside of our own silos. Now, there's been a lot more attention to the importance of science communication in the last few years, and that's in large part because of a little virus that showed up. Actually, the first boom of this virus in the US happened in Seattle, and I know that because in February 2020, I gave a talk, I think in the same room, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science conference, and came home sicker than I could remember being in a very long time. So as we saw COVID explode around the world, we also saw what happens when we have a poorly informed community of people in all different spaces who don't know how to come to terms with a lot of these ideas related to evolution, when it comes to viral variants, when it comes to decreasing transmission. All of these things that seem very easy for us to explain and yet became controversial and led to conspiracy theories. And all of a sudden, all eyes are on how we can do a better job talking about science issues that impact all of us. But the truth is, of course, it didn't start with COVID. It didn't start with C.P. Snow. This has been going on for a very long time. All of this has happened before, and it will all happen again. Something James Barrie said. Just for fun, does anyone know who James Barrie is? You've probably read him, or at least heard of him. He's the author of Peter Pan. But I think it's true for all of our challenges related to science and society and just bringing people together. It keeps happening, but there's a lot we can do to make things better. Now, challenges related to misinformation and conspiracy theories run rampant in the field that I work in today at Michigan State. Most of my research is in congressional science policy, but day to day I work on global food security, agriculture, and climate change. And you might have noticed that when it comes to information about what we eat, we're just very confused. Everyone's on a different diet. Are we eating carbs? Are we not eating carbs? Does caffeine make our heart rate dangerously high, or is it good for us every day? Should we be drinking red wine? I mean, we see all of these goofy ideas, some grounded in science, some not, over and over. But at the same time, we watch reality television shows where celebrity chefs are cooking up all sorts of fancy dishes, and we share recipes with our friends and family. And I think, would anyone here call themselves a foodie? Raise your hands if you do. A few of us. I like to eat. I think most of us would call ourselves a foodie. And one of the things we do at Michigan State is we look at attitudes related to how Americans feel about the food system, what they know, what they understand. And we see that 80% of consumers say that they want to learn more and understand more about our global food system and how our food is produced. But when we ask where they go first, second, third for information, what do you think they tell us? You're all on social media, or most of you are. We hear about YouTube influencers and TikTok influencers and who's posting what on Instagram and what fun little hack we should be doing. So there's this mismatch between what we want to know and our willingness to seek out information from experts and scientists and people who have the training to really know what they're talking about. And unfortunately, these influencers, and I'm not saying every influencer doesn't know what they're talking about, but some of the time, they often have a much bigger audience than the research community does, and that leads to lots of problems. And of course, this isn't just about the food system. There are so many issues, many of you work on all sorts of them here, that are changing, or fundamentally changing our world in science and technology. Whether it's the efficacy of vaccines and the fact that we're now seeing the reemergence of diseases like polio, even though they had been all but eradicated thanks to modern science. Advances in neuroscience are starting to change our concept of what we think free will means. Changes in how we understand DNA are literally, fundamentally changing the food system in ways that people don't understand, and there's a lot of fear around that. And I work on issues related to global food security, as I said. In Michigan, we pay a lot of attention, of course, and we should be all around the world, to clean water, public health, climate change, viral variants. Many of us, I think, are very interested now in artificial intelligence and what that means for the future of technology, for the future of research and science and the bioeconomy. And on and on and on and on. So it's not enough to just be doing the science. We have to be prepared to tell these stories, because when we don't, someone else does it for us, and we don't like the result. It wasn't always the same divisive environment that we have today. So in the late 1950s, early 60s, we had the space race. There was the launch of Sputnik. Science journalists themselves were becoming a bit of a celebrity community, and scientists were often celebrated as heroes. We had presidents start to surround themselves with a cabinet of advisors, including many scientists. Kennedy is a good example. President Biden does the same, though. And at the time, the percent of the federal budget that went to R&D, that research and development, was nearly 12%. So nearly 12% of federal spending went to a lot of the science stuff, more than a tenth. And that's a lot. Does anyone want to guess what that figure looks like in 2024? Y'all are a little pessimistic. It's not usually, someone said 1. No, it's not 1%, but it's 2.4%, and that's very recent. That's from Matt Horahan at the Federation of American Scientists. I call him every few months and tell him to update me on what the figure is. 2.4% is one of the lowest it's ever been, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's not just cutting and spending specifically towards science, but the point is that if our national priorities can be illustrated by where we're spending tax money, then science, research, technology, it's just not a priority in this country. And I know I'm a little bit focused on the US. This is an international meeting, but that's where my research is. So I think a lot of this can be broadened to include many other places in the world right now too. I'm not going to spend the whole time on politics, but I will say in my research, I want to know how we make decisions about science policy issues, not just how the government makes the decisions, but then how that percolates out into broader society at large. But when you dig into the research, you find more and more There aren't a lot of papers, and what's been written, whether it's in communication, political science, rhetoric, many different fields, it largely focuses on the people we elect to office. But as I mentioned, I used to work in the Senate, and I'm keenly interested on those people who are working behind the scenes, the folks we never get to see that are taking meetings, that are thinking about science and tech issues, and that are telling their bosses, those people that we pay attention to, how to vote. So I want to know what the congressional staffers are doing. The young whippersnapper in the middle, who for some strange reason is kneeling, is me about 20 years ago. So in the research I've been doing the last 5 or so years, I have been interviewing chiefs of staff, legislative directors, some secretaries in administrations, asking them who gets priority, who are you listening to, where do you go for information when you want to find out more about a science issue. And I'm not going to go into all the details at all, but I just thought I'd show you one slide from some of those results. It's a little confusing to look at just on its own, but what you see here are different sources of information ranked by priority. Party leadership and committee staff are the two most important sources for congressional staffers who have a lot of authority. Number 3, as you see, is the internet. Now, anyone with a connection to the internet can go on and call themselves an expert and put any kind of nonsense out into the world. But that is a key source that staffers start with when they want to find out information. And then, of course, a lot of this is understandable. Constituents are important, colleagues are important, government resources. Industry lobbyists are pretty important too, and it's a very rational reason why. These are people with a lot of institutional knowledge that have built relationships with staffers over decades, and they may have some bias and they may be perceived as having bias, but they also develop friendships, they develop trust, and that really matters when we're trying to convey what we know and figure out who to trust. Academic scientists, think tanks, and non-governmental organizations don't fare as well as some of these other groups. I'd also like you to pay attention to the fact that the arrows go sometimes in one direction, sometimes in both. This is because information flow can go one or two ways. Staffers are seeking out information from the internet, but they're going back and forth between colleagues and committee staff and many other resources. What you'll note about the people doing research, the scientists, the think tanks, the NGOs, they're showing up at congressional offices, but they're very rarely sought out by policymakers and staff themselves. Just something to think about. Now, I want to branch out from my points on politics and policy to look a little bit about the public. And what do I mean by the public? I don't really believe that there is one public. There's not one community of people that's homogenous that we should be gearing all our messaging to. But when we look at some survey information, and I run some national survey work out of Michigan State, we see some broad conversation points about science literacy. So I put a few of them here. These are really recent numbers. We see that 38% of Americans, and again, sorry, it's US focused, but 38% of Americans correctly identified as true the universe began with a huge explosion. This is from the National Science Foundation indicators. They put these out every 2 or so years. There are different ways to interpret began with a big explosion, but that said, 38% is kind of low. Only 72% correctly answered as true, Earth revolves around the sun. Now, in polling, we get things wrong all the time, but that's lower than I think a lot of us would expect on that question. I'll just say that. And then coming from our own work out of Michigan State, we found that 45% did not know that all food contains genes. That's an interesting one from the perspective of we have something that the science and technology is way ahead of where the policy's at. But if almost half of the people in the US don't even know that food contains genes, the public, whatever the public means, has been largely left out of that conversation. When at the same time, it's become this very divisive topic that people have a knee-jerk reaction to without really understanding what that means. Now, all of these kinds of stats, they're interesting, they're funny, we see a lot of news articles coming out of them, but I don't think they're an accurate reflection of science literacy or what we know. There's this misconception that science is a bunch of facts, that we just tell people information and then they know the facts and then they believe the science. It's called the deficit model. It doesn't work. We know the deficit model is inaccurate. But we need communities of people to understand science and recognize that it's really a process, that it builds on itself and changes over time. And I think that's where we've really failed to impart what science means. And because we have this sense, I really didn't like how during the last few years we saw a lot of very politicized science that said I believe in science, I believe in facts. It's not just facts. It has to be about the scientific method, the scientific process, which is related to who tells our stories. Traditionally, we tell our stories through very slow, meticulous research. We're often doing it over years. We're submitting it to different scientific journals. It goes through a peer review process. Here's some old sea cucumber data if you're keen on that. And it's important that we have this peer review process. It matters. It means we've rigorously tested hypotheses and come to a conclusion, and it's worth sharing. That's okay. But then when it's published, it comes out in a peer-reviewed journal that often sits behind a paywall. And the only people who have access to that journal are people with a subscription through their university or some other means. They're not even the one science community or one specialist community. They've become siloed in subfields of subfields of subfields. And then no one has access to that's starting to question what the research says. And for a while, that wasn't ideal, but that was okay. And then in the 2000s and beyond, we are living in a very different media environment where information is traveling faster than ever before to places never imagined possible. And science, in many ways, is competing with that challenge. And so you're a taxpayer, you want to find out what's going on with macular degeneration or some other issue. You're not going to read the research. You're going to see what Joe Rogan or some other media talking head has said about it, and you're going to go, oh, I think I should only eat a carnivorous diet, or like whatever the pop story is around an issue. And it causes some real problems, and it gets us into this crisis of science communication that I think we find ourselves in today. So a moment about what doesn't work, and then we're going to shift into how to be more effective as a science communicator. Why do we fail? What doesn't work in science? Before I start telling you, what do you think some of our challenges are when we go and try to talk about what we do and who we are and why our stuff matters? Lots of jargon. We are, do you mean slow to do the research? Absolutely. Anybody else? I'm afraid I can't hear so well, but I hear some good ideas, I think. Okay, I can't hear very well. I'm so sorry. But I'll just run through some of them. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some of the things that I think stymie our progress. We take a one-size-fits-all approach. So we teach people best practices. We teach scientists, young and career scientists, best approaches to communication, and we act as if there's one community we're speaking with. When who those people are, what their experience is, what their culture is, what their background is, all of these factors play into how they're going to interpret the message that we have. And we've really got to understand more about our audience and community to have influence. We report just the facts. This is what I was getting at about a moment ago when this deficit model of facts, it just doesn't work. We can't tell people a bunch of things that we say are true and expect that they're going to take that and work with that in their own day-to-day lives. We lecture without listening. So academia has been set up in this very hierarchical way where someone with lots of information usually stands up in the front and provides a lecture. It's always nice for me to be able to speak to a big audience, but my preference is always to have a really big, engaging conversation rather than just talking at someone. When do we learn? It's not when people talk at us. It's when we can ask questions and participate and make it a two-way learning process. I'm learning about the community I'm speaking with. They're learning about where I'm coming from and how I came to have these positions or facts or present this research that I have. We choose the wrong ambassadors. This is a big one. That part of building relationships, the embedded trust someone needs to have impact with an audience, that's really important. So because of the hierarchical nature of research in academia, we're often picking the people with the most accolades in science, the people with the biggest reputations. And those things matter, yes, and I'll get to that in a moment. However, we also need to be thinking about who's most familiar to the group that we want to speak with. Who do they recognize? Did they watch Mr. Wizard as a kid? Or are they, I don't know who the young people watch. I know a little bit about it. But what's familiar and who do they like? Who do they connect with? We dumb down the science. Personally, I don't love the phrase dumbing down. But we share science that is done in a way where it's not particularly respectful of the audience. We act as if they don't know anything. But usually, they're very smart. They just don't have the training that we've had. So we have to find a common language that maintains a sense of respect and makes it more of an equal footing relationship. We put messages where people aren't. There have been many, many campaigns. I've known of some of them. I've been involved with some of them where so much thought is put into what the message is, but we don't follow through and have a great plan to execute it. We shouldn't be putting billboards about protecting our coasts only in the middle of the country, for example. There actually was a very large, very expensive initiative that ended up doing that. I won't name it. But it was kind of swabbed from the internet after it failed. Which brings me to the rest of what I'm here to talk to you about today. How can we be more effective as communicators? Now, back when I worked on Capitol Hill, I might have meetings with 5 groups of scientists, different kinds of scientists a day, on a single topic. They might leave behind all sorts of literature, even textbooks, about what my position should be as a staffer who is making recommendations to my boss. But at the end of the day, my role was to write my boss, then Senator Bill Nelson, who now, by the way, runs NASA, which I think is kind of cool. But I would have to write a memo for him. It would have 3 bullet points. I'd have all that information. It would have to have 3 bullet points. What's the issue? Why does it matter? How does it affect our state, our constituents? Those 3 bullet points can be applied, I think, to any science topic. So as you're thinking about your research, be carefully considering, not just today, but as you go home, as you're back in the lab or back with students or wherever life takes you, be thinking about, what am I doing? Why does it matter? How does it affect my audience? Whether it's one student, whether it's a community of kids in an elementary school, whoever you're speaking to, that will always be important to have in your back pocket as you're making presentations. Now, I'm going to start with a little bit on the literature of what effective science communication involves. This is kind of what I found in my research and my colleagues' research as I was thinking about my own approach to working in science policy. So some of the core things, they seem intuitive, they seem obvious, but we're not often thinking about them when we're working in science communication or when we're reaching out with our efforts to connect. It's pretty simple. We want to be able to demonstrate that we care, that we hear them, that we're listening. We want to show empathy. And we want to look for what we have in common before making judgments about why we're different. I think that's especially important in the policy realm because we often visit offices with expectations about how they feel about things that we value. We should be looking for what connects us before we start making assumptions about what divides us. Maybe we're not from the same party politically, but I'll go into an office and I'll notice, oh, we're both parents. Tell me about your family. Or maybe we grew up in the same state. It could be all sorts of things, but we really have to do more to look for ourselves in each other. We want to be able to make people feel like we care about them, we hear them, we want to understand them, and we relate to them. And there are other pieces as well that are pretty important. Being able to demonstrate you have competency in a field. Of course, all of you at this meeting can do that. That does make a difference. That does give you someone's ear a bit longer. They know you have a PhD in X, Y, and Z. They're willing to give you a few moments, maybe not minutes, but a few moments to start a conversation. We need to think very carefully about the format, what it looks like. What does the message look like? What if I'm speaking with a chief of staff, it's going to sound very different than if I'm speaking with my son's elementary school. The culture that we're from, the culture that we grew up in, the culture that we're familiar with and comfortable with, that plays a big role in how our message is received. And of course, the person delivering the message, what I was getting at earlier, choosing the right ambassador, that matters tremendously. I'm pretty easy to find, so I get a lot of invitations to speak to different groups, but often I'll recognize that I'm not the right person to have that conversation. So if I can immediately think of someone who would connect better with that community, I will try to partner with that group rather than making it about a lecture, because that comes with trust, that comes with those relationships, and that gets you further in making the case for whatever you want to talk about. Now, I show Carl Sagan and Back to the Night. So I am a Gen Xer. So if you want to reach me and you craft your message to have like a cute 90s theme with a Carl Sagan as a, well, he's not around anymore, but one of my heroes, you know, Carl Sagan as the messenger, I am all in. I am going to focus on that. I am going to listen to everything that's part of that conversation because that connects with me. But when I think about my 11-year-old, he doesn't care. But if Mr. Beast says it, does anyone know who Mr. Beast is? A few people probably do. Mr. Beast is the most popular YouTuber in the whole world. If Mr. Beast says it, he's going to listen. And thankfully, Mr. Beast is really into ocean conservation, so it's kind of nice. We also want to be telling stories that connect the dots. So in my PBS series, this is something that I really try to do, and in the work that we do at Michigan State as well. And to give you an example of what that looks like, an issue that I'm passionate about, that I spend a lot of time working on, relates to food waste. Food waste is something we don't really tend to think about very often. It's not a sexy topic, but it's a really important topic on a global scale. But there's different frames, there's different lenses when we tell this story. So when I'm talking about food waste, I might start with something like, did you know we waste between 1/3 and 1/2 of the food that we produce in the US? I mean, that's wild, because that's not just food. That's wasting all that water, all that energy, producing lots of carbon emissions, wasting a lot of fertilizer to grow a heck of a lot of food that just winds up in our landfills and then produces methane and other problems that add to the greenhouse gas effect. That's going to connect with people in sustainability who are thinking about sustainability, resilience, all of these different issues. But I might be addressing a different kind of audience. I can tell you as a parent, when I read that 6.1 million US kids, and that's extremely conservative, it's probably far higher, 6.1 million children in the US live in food insecure households. As a parent, living in a country that's considered a wealthy country, I truly feel that hunger and children should never be part of the same sentence, and yet we have millions of children that don't always have enough to eat. So this becomes about redistribution. It's not just about wasted food, it's about maybe we can do something with all that food that we're not using. And at the same time, food waste accounts for, at minimum, again, probably much higher, but we tend to be conservative with the numbers, accounts for 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So in all these conversations about climate change and needing to innovate and create new technologies to address our climate challenges, here we have something that we're literally tossing in the garbage that can have a tremendous impact on the future. What I mean by this is we have a lot of ways to talk about science and a lot of frames around single issues, whether it has to do with public health, whether it has to do with your research specifically. Think about that audience and what makes sense to them, and then connect with them through what you find you have in common, your shared values. What do we know works? What do we know from public speakers and science communicators that's effective, that's been happening for 15, 20 years and more? There are a few basic lessons that we can draw on that can really help us each as individuals. So at the close of this talk, I kind of want to walk you through some of the things that you can use on a personal basis to hopefully be a little bit more effective. And not everybody has to do everything. That's also something that I want to emphasize. You only want to work with what's comfortable for you, what you feel is something that you can utilize. We never want to be disingenuous and try a bunch of strategies and just not get our message across. So just be thinking about this. I don't expect everyone to leave here today and be the most dynamic science communicator, but hopefully it's given you a little something to kind of think about as you go about your lives and your research, and consider the impact of the science community and our work and just really the current and future climate of society. So the first thing is pretty simple. It's uncomfortable for some of us, but engaging in the current media environment is really important. When I first started blogging, and so actually, if any of you were at Ed Young's talk a few days ago, Ed and I were some of the first science bloggers. There was like one science blogging network, 12 bloggers, and all of us were on it together. And so I was delighted to see that Ed was speaking with you all here today. He's one of my favorite science writers. And I was sorry to miss him because we didn't overlap. But engaging in that environment, finding creative ways to tell stories with emerging new technologies in social media and off social media can really help. It's not comfortable for everyone, but I think we're coming a long way. I think more and more scientists are working in these spaces, and there are all sorts of opportunities to do it. There's not one right space. And with the shift away from Twitter, as Twitter's kind of changed and become X, I think there are more and more creative new opportunities with Blue Sky, with Threads, with Mastodon, with other spaces that we can be having conversations outside of our own silos in ways that resonate. One of the biggest ones, which I find in my policy work with folks in Congress, when I work with really any community, is building relationships. So a big problem with scientific trainings on how to engage, especially with members of Congress, but anyone, is we focus on the what, like how do we package it well? How do we get this down to a one-pager? But we're not emphasizing the fact that there's no one and done. You don't show up, deliver your science, and leave and expect things to change, expect to get anywhere, expect to get funding from NIH. You have to keep showing up, and that means building relationships over time with people in those spaces. Defining the why. So this is a big emphasis of my colleague John Besley, who's in science communication, also at Michigan State. You can't just say, you have to really think about why you want to communicate what you want to communicate. So it's not enough to say, oh, I want to do science communication because I want people to know more. Pause and say, well, why? Well, because I think that if more people know what I do, they'll be healthier or better off. Okay, well, why? And you kind of can go through several levels of this with why you think you're communicating and really drill down to the fundamental reason that communicating what you do matters and starting there. So figure out what your ultimate goal is and then go back and craft your story around that goal. Know your audience. This is what I've been talking about in much of the time I've been up here. Think about what's familiar, what their cultural references are. I know I'm repeating myself, but repetition is important too. Really recognize what resonates with a particular group, and then use that to inform your approach. Translate the scientific language. So someone early on said jargon is a big problem. That is absolutely true. The acronyms familiar to you, like in my case, R&D, could mean something very different to the folks that were my colleagues all of those years ago, right? I'm thinking research and development, they're thinking Republicans and Democrats. Don't take for granted that everyone is coming from the same space you are, and dial it back. But dial it back in a way that's respectful and that leaves space for everyone to develop an understanding of each other, to bridge that gap of mutual incomprehension that C.P. Snow described all those years ago. Of course, that's part of stating your key IDs clearly. So think about your three. What is it? Why does it matter? How does it affect my audience? And then figure out how to get there. Recognize that the first few minutes you have with an audience, whether it's one person in an elevator, one chance encounter at a party, one meeting at a conference, they're often tuned in not for 5 minutes, not even for 1 minute, but you have 20 to 30 seconds to make an impression. And so in the workshops I do, and if this were a smaller group, this would have been a lot of fun, but I really try to drill down to how we make an introduction. It sounds silly, it sounds like something we're doing in elementary school, but this can matter a lot. So I encourage you, well beyond this conference, to go home and be thinking about what you say to someone when they say, tell me about what you do. They don't want to hear everything. They don't want to hear all of your methods, and I have on there too, I jumped over it, but don't try to explain everything. We often get so excited about our research that we want to take our audience through every step along the way and describe all of the details and then tell that story, because we're so excited about our specific area of science. But when you have that introduction, as I like to say, in your back pocket, when you know what you want to get across and you're polished and you're confident, it gets you to the next part of the conversation where then they can ask you questions, they feel comfortable, you've demonstrated your competence, you know what might come next. Now, what happens when we get asked at a party what we do, or any social gathering. There's usually a lot of kind of like, oh, well, like, yeah, I work in research on food, and I do some communication, and I work with PBS, and like that's just, that doesn't really build interest. But in my case, just as an example, I might say, well, I work at the intersection of science, politics, and people. Broadly, I study how congressional staffers make science policy decisions, but I'm also focused on the global food system and the future of agriculture and climate change. And I stop, and I pause, and I wait. And because I know what I'm coming in with and I know what kinds of questions to expect, I'm prepared for whatever the follow-up is. And there's not always a follow-up, but when you're prepared, that introduction, it really matters. So with my students or with the workshops I do, we practice with each other, could be really helpful, but don't just practice with people who are part of your field. Think about telling your child or your partner or someone completely outside of the realm of what's familiar to you in your professional space, all about what you do, and have a slightly different version depending on who that audience is. What I hope you've been hearing throughout this talk is that we all have a role to play and we can all contribute to improving science communication and bridging science and society in so many different ways. We have to find our strengths. Maybe it's showing up at a local school. Maybe it's writing an op-ed. Maybe it's working at a translator with people who don't speak the same language, but helping to translate information into another space, into another community. We all can make science communication more effective. We can make science have more influence, but we have to be willing to work in that space and be thinking about those relationships. And finally, I think keep this in mind too as you're giving talks, as you're speaking. Always leave with what the take-home should be, because a lot of people might not be listening to everything that comes in between your introduction and your goodbye. So if there's one thing that you remember from this talk today, I hope it's this. The most important part of communicating, not just in science, but in anything, is also the simplest, but it's the thing that we forget most. It's taking the time to listen. It's always pausing to figure out not just if your audience has understood what you've said, but it's leaving space for questions. It's leaving a chance, when possible, for a dialogue rather than a lecture. And always, always, always leave contact information, so if questions or misunderstandings or conspiracy theories from their friends come up down the road, they can come back and ask you questions because you've now started to build a relationship. So with that, I want to listen, so I am going to pause and say thank you and see if you have any questions, because we've touched on a lot of different topics. So I will just say thank you. And if you want to ask anything, I think there's some microphones.
Don't go anywhere. That was wonderful. We do have time for questions. We already have somebody over there at mic 1, so I'm going to stand out of the way and let you communicate.
Hi, my name is Tetsu Young. I was expecting a super long line, so maybe not so prepared. But in my line of work, I connect Japan and the world. I mean, both bilaterally, inbound, outbound, in the CRO, pharma, and academic world. So maybe you touched upon it a little bit, but I guess my question is, with cultural linguistic barriers, you have any thoughts on the communication skills and different tips that you would have that would allow you to be a better communicator across cultures?
That is such a great question. I'm really glad you asked, and I feel like you probably have a lot of tips to begin with. I worked a bit with colleagues in Japan. I'm actually really interested in spending some time there on global climate change because there's a lot of great parallels in research. But doing your homework beforehand when you know you're going to be engaged with a community, and I'm sure you do this, you recognize that there are things that are just very different and very common. And if you're going into space that doesn't look exactly like the culture that you're familiar with, you need to ask questions beforehand to be prepared. And what I mean is, if I'm working with my colleagues in Japan, I'm going to make sure I have my business card prepared. That's, I think, less common than what we do here in the US. But of course, you must have that business card to pass on. You must understand what some of those customs are that are just not perfunctory, but familiar. And that shows a level of respect and a level of desire to understand the culture as well as the people, and I think opens some real doors. But I feel like I could ask you, how you go about that and what your approach is.
No, I think you answered that question with your last tip, which is listen. There's a lot of messages that are getting communicated without words.
Yes.
So the underlying messages have to be really seeked out, and it's a lot of listening and a lot of attention to everything that's going on. That's, I think, the biggest thing. But it's a hard skill to develop, definitely. Well, thank you very much. This was very insightful.
Over number.
Hi, my name is Kuratalayan Shako. I'm an MS1. So I loved your talk, by the way, and primarily because I've been thinking about it. But I also struggle with coming up with ideas. I'm in the back of my head, but I never am able to really come up with ideas. But I kind of want to ask you, as a medical student, I mean, I'm sure there's so many other medical students here. What would you like for us to what would you like to see in us to make the better or the future better for science? What ideas do you have just for us as medical students?
Well, I'll start by saying I love that you asked that question. I'm really encouraged by just how much younger scientists are thinking about these issues and making them a priority and a value. I can tell you, when I was in graduate school at the University of Maine, there was someone in my cohort. I was talking to someone about this right before this talk. Someone in my cohort who complained to our chair that part of a grade in a class had to do with her presentation, because she said, I went into science so I would not have to talk to anyone. And that was probably around 2003. So I really feel like we've grown leaps and bounds in our comfort with this. I've consulted at a lot of universities that are interested in expanding their science communication programs, their science policy programs. So the interdisciplinary nature of a lot of the movement that we see is really encouraging. To your question more directly, I would say there are some wonderful groups that are solely focused on getting young scientists and engineers to be more engaged, to be thinking about how they can contribute. One of the organizations I co-founded back in 2007, if you're at all interested in policy, I don't run it anymore, but it's called Science Debate. Now it's actually called Science on the Ballot. It's run by a group, it's a project within the National Science Policy Network. They solely exist to help early career scientists and engineers become more effective communicators, become more effective at navigating policy. And they have workshops and they show up at conferences, and they're an incredible bunch of very enthusiastic folks that have a lot of tools and resources. So I think connecting into some of those networks, joining a chapter, thinking about, say, science in the election of the Science Debate, now Science on the Ballot, all of these different activities can put you in that space with people who have similar questions. And then it's not just on you to come up with ideas. You're kind of sharing that space and building on each other, and that's how science works.
Thank you so much.
We're going to go to 3, 4, and then back to 1.
Hi, my name's Andrew. So, as you said in your talk, science isn't just a set of facts, it's a process. And that process involves collecting data, and sometimes that data is ambiguous or it might not be replicable. And so I was wondering, you wouldn't maybe go to the press when there's a single arXiv paper that's published with a single author and it's never been replicated anywhere, but also going to the press when there's a dozen papers published in high impact journals with a lot of citations. That might be a little bit too late because the science is already settled. So when in that process do you go to the press? You talked about what, why, and how, but when? But when?
That's a good question, too. I have a lot of different ways I would answer that. And I think also that your point about uncertainty is very interesting. Sometimes I give entire talks on uncertainty and our understanding of what that word means and how different it is in science and society at large. I think it leads to a lot of challenging problems, but without getting into the weeds of that, I would say, if you're working on something and it's getting ready to come out, I think there's this sense that a lot of us have to wait until we're done, until the journalists approach us. They're not going to find our work. There's a paper in a journal called the Public Understanding of Science. It's by Julie Zaleski, who is at Ohio State University. Now, it's a little old now. It came out, I think, in the 2000s. But she found that by looking at news coverage of science articles, it was far less than like 0.1% of articles ever get covered by the media. And the irony of that was she published it in a journal that largely sits behind a paywall, even at most universities. So even we couldn't get access to it unless we had the right folks to talk to. I recommend, one, if you think it's worth sharing, and it's at the level of, you know, being replicated, whatever level it is, that it's not just like a hypothesis that you're putting out there, you can approach journalists. You can reach out to people at Science Insider or someone that's already published the news section on something related to your field and say, hey, this is what I'm finding, would you be interested? Something else I recommend, a lot of people still haven't heard of an outlet called The Conversation. The Conversation is a nonprofit that was founded to tell better science stories, and what's great about it is the journalists are the scientists. So if you're getting ready to publish and your research is coming out, you contact The Conversation, and they will have some really great editors work with you to tell that story. And it's freely accessible, which means if you publish in The Conversation and it's a good article, it also runs in the Washington Post and the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune. Some of the articles that I've written that have gotten the most press wound up starting with The Conversation. You don't make money by doing it, but you're getting your work out there, and you are in control of the narrative, which I think can be so powerful. So these are just different ideas, but I would absolutely say don't wait to reach out. Use the people you know and use the people covering topics related to yours, and they will be interested. As a, you know, I sort of moonlight as a journalist once in a while. It's how I know Ed. And we're often looking for stories, and we just can't be everywhere at once. But if it's really big, if it affects people's health and well-being, I think we want to know.
Thanks.
Great. Down number 4 over there.
Hi there, my name is Tassine. Thank you so much for your talk today. I think that being able to talk about science outside of science is one of the biggest things that, as a community, we have to do. My question is, and I think the first questioner spoke to the political landscape nowadays. It seems that we've gone from a world in which there were two sides of the aisle who disagreed on how to handle the same problem. And now it seems that we can't even agree on what the problem is, almost as though we're in different realities. What are your thoughts on applying the principles that you talk about earlier to addressing this new polarized political gap that we find ourselves in and that we find affecting science?
Yeah, I wrote a dissertation on that. I have a lot of thoughts. I think that's a great question. The problem isn't new, but the problem is much worse, right? Everything's become politicized, even things that shouldn't be. And, you know, I think it comes down to being willing to be in uncomfortable spaces. Not so much to start a fight. I don't mean, you know, show up at some organization's rally and say something opposite what they're saying. But we were talking before about, in my research, how often I would speak to folks on the GOP side, I would speak to folks who are Democrats, and many of the chiefs of staff, legislative directors I spoke to coming from the Republican side of the aisle said, you know, I'm really aware that when scientists come to Capitol Hill, they're going to visit my colleagues and they're not coming into my office. So why should I listen to anything they have to say if they're not going to give me the same time that they're giving my colleagues? I think many of us in science make assumptions about how our message will be received without necessarily taking the time to get to know the people in those spaces. And that goes back to that point about building relationships over time, about building trust. Many staffers actually don't have the same personal party affiliation as the person that they work for, but we're not really, we don't see them, so we don't know that. It gets much bigger than politics, I think, when we talk about these divides, but the more that we can be in those spaces making our case, the better off we're going to be as a society. And it's on, I mean, I think, you know, more and more of us are thinking like Renaissance scientists. We're thinking about our research, but we're thinking about its broad impacts and implications. And by the way, just in terms of grant writing, there is a lot of reward for thinking about your outreach and broader impacts as you're writing grants. So I have many people in my kind of sphere of science who have been partnering with me because they want an outreach component, and I can provide that for them. So think about the media people that you might want to work with and collaborate where you can.
Great.
Thank you.
I'm really happy where so many questions have been stimulating. I think we'll be able to take one more from number one here, and then will you be around for a little bit after?
Out, sure.
She'll be around. Sheril will be around after and happy to talk to you. So can you ask her briefly your last question?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Arun Sivanandam. Sheril, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I think your bio said you're from Michigan State. I went to mid school at Michigan State, so go green.
Go white.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've always been thinking it's very timely because as we're coming out of the pandemic, we're doing a lot of meetings, virtually over Zoom, over Microsoft Teams, and that's not just to colleagues internationally. That's colleagues even here in the same city, in the same town. And it's been tricky because the more colleagues you have on these virtual calls, the harder it is, I feel, to get your point across quickly and align on various agenda topics to continue with forward progress. During one of my previous roles, I noticed something very interesting from a regulatory colleague. He was pretty senior. When a lot of people were talking and they were presenting ideas to him, rather than saying no or I disagree, he just didn't say anything. It was a big, big pause, and it was a silence. It almost made people uncomfortable. But I noticed that he used it as a communication tactic to just create some space and then shift the conversation just slightly and get people aligned very quickly on a disagreement. I wonder what your thoughts on that as using silence as a communication tool.
I think that's really interesting. I like to point out, it sounds silly, but that last slide that says, listen, you rearrange those letters, it spells silent. I mean, I think there's real value in silence. The Zoom component of what you were addressing, I mean, I think that's tricky. And I mean, there's all these things I didn't have time to touch on, which involve interpersonal communication. I mean, we didn't go into decision reasoning. I do a lot of work related to confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and interpersonal communication where when we're in the same room, we're making eye contact. Mm-hmm. That really matters. When we're on Zoom, we're pretending to make eye contact in a super awkward way that kind of can move into this sort of sense of uncanny valley at times. It's less comfortable. It's provided more opportunities for all different people with other challenges, and I think that's great, but I think it has posed barriers that we don't fully realize into that kind of space. I like leaving leaving space for silence, as I've been kind of saying the whole time, getting people to really hear each other and not just wait to speak. There's real value in that too. But I don't know, the way you preface that kind of said doesn't say he doesn't disagree, but just pauses. I don't know how intimidating that might sound. The tone of that really depends on the context, but it's interesting.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again. That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Thanks, Sheril. That was fantastic, and you could see by the questions that were mounting that people have lots of comments and inquiries for you. So at the end of this meeting, I'll end my term as the ARVO president. And at this time, I'd like to acknowledge the assistance and support that I've gotten from the executive committee, from the board of trustees, and particularly from the ARVO staff. When you see a big meeting like this go so smoothly, that does not happen on its own. There's a lot going on behind the curtain, as it were. And I think I'd like to give a round of applause to the ARVO staff for making this work. We're very lucky to have such a group of dedicated and talented folks taking care of us. So it's now time for me to pass the torch to the very capable hands of ARVO's president-elect, Dr. Vas Sada. Dr. Sada is from the Doheny Eye Institute in UCLA in Pasadena, and he will lead ARVO as our president for the remainder of 2024 through the annual meeting in 2025. So please join me in welcoming Vas to the stage.
I'll extend my good morning to everyone. Hopefully my mic is on. But thank you very much, Pat. Thank you for your exceptional guidance and leadership of ARVO during this past year. I have incredibly big shoes to fill, unfortunately, as a result. Actually be impossible, but I'm glad that we've trapped you on the board for another year. So that's good news for all of us. I also want to give a shout out and a huge thanks to Lancey Cohen and the entire ARVO staff. We're so lucky to have an amazing staff. I think they deserve another round of applause for putting on this meeting. I also want to thank our convention centers and AV staff and our photographer. I think many times they work in the shadows, and I think we need to appreciate them and all that they do. I also want to thank all of you for coming to this final ARVO 2024 keynote session. Thank you, Sheril, for the brilliant talk. And actually thanking all of you for your wonderful contributions through the course of this meeting, because you guys all know that it's your active participation and engagement in ARVO that really makes this meeting such a wonderful and inspiring experience. So I'm very honored and humbled to be able to serve as the next president of ARVO. And actually, one of my initial roles as ARVO president is selecting the theme for the following year's meeting. So I think you'd all agree that throughout this week, we've had pretty incredible discussions. We've all witnessed this convergence of groundbreaking research, cutting-edge technologies, and a whole lot of new insights into our understanding of eye diseases. So from the latest advances in AI to innovative applications of imaging technologies and big data science applied from the microscopic to the microscopic level, we've, I think, just started to glimpse the future of what might be possible in vision science. So, with this in mind, I have selected the theme for our 2025 annual meeting, which hopefully will start to appear. Drum roll, do I have to do drum roll? Which is I to the power of 3, imaging, innovation, and intelligence in vision science. And so for those of you who are wondering, yes, that's AI generated. And no, it's not from Pandora, so it's not Avatar or something of that sort. So in any event, I think you would all agree that the future of our field really is limitless. We're really going to be expanding the frontiers of vision science, pushing the boundaries of what probably many of us thought wasn't even possible. But at the same time, though, we're going to be doing it in a thoughtful, responsible, and ethical manner. So I think we'll continue to witness the power of innovation as it unlocks new avenues for us in understanding and preserving vision through these AI and innovation and technology-driven insights. So really looking forward to seeing all of you in beautiful Salt Lake City. And I want to share with you now a video reviewing not only our week in Seattle, but also a preview of what Salt Lake City and ARVO 2025 annual meeting will have to offer. So maybe we can cue up the video now. So that was great. That was a very energizing video. So in any event, I look forward to serving as your president for this next year and welcoming all of you to ARVO in 2025 in Salt Lake City next May. So thanks again to Dr. Sheril Kirshenbaum for today's wonderful keynote address, and safe travels to all of you on your journey home or to wherever your next destination may be. But this concludes the 2024 ARVO annual meeting. Thank you.